unintended consequences of other things that we're doing, like driving our cars around, producing electricity, that sort of thing, as opposed to solar engineering, which is changes, purposeful changes, which and the technology, the human activities are undertaken with the primary purpose of changing the climate. So there are whole different flavors, but one of the most interesting, potentially effective, and most scary is this idea of solar radiation management, where we would essentially inject into the stratosphere reflecting particles, and depending on the density, say by emitting them from airplanes that fly around, and that doing so, the amount of particles you put in the stratosphere, we could tune the temperature of the Earth. And so the videos talk about that a little bit. This has only recently become, it's sort of floated around for a long time as an idea. It's gained salience as people worry both about the slow speed of emission reductions and the rapid acceleration in many respects of climate impacts. And advocates of this, including David Keith, who is one of the people in one of the videos, see this as some combination of something you would do in an emergency, that if we all of a sudden ended it with some sort of runaway climate change, like outgassing of the Arctic tundra, that sort of thing, or as a bridge to get us hold climate change in check as we slowed the giant tanker of emissions and sort of shaved the peak. So there's different deployment scenarios, but to date, geoengineering of this sort, solar radiation management, doesn't exist in any way other than in computer models and in natural analogs. I mean, so the classic one that people point to is volcanoes. So for instance, when Mount Pinatubo went off, about 20 years ago now, that it injected some huge amount of sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere. This is at a time when the world was pretty well instrumented, so we could measure the plumes going around the Earth. They took several weeks to mix fully, east-west and north-south, and they stayed up there for about a year plus, and they cooled the Earth for about a half a degree. So this was a natural experiment that showed that in fact these sulfate aerosols can cool the Earth, and volcanoes through history have resulted in major climate change. So in some sense, you can think of this as sort of an artificial volcano without blowing up the mountain part and just putting the stratosphere, the aerosols in the atmosphere. No technology has existed. There's been a lot of computer modeling, and we can discuss that if you like. But I mean, the essential point is that we can likely change the temperature of the Earth with some control. But it is not like returning it to a pre-climate change state, that the heating differentials are different in the atmosphere. So there might be all sorts of unintended and difficult to predict side effects, like changes in the monsoons and changes in rain patterns, and more storms someplace, less storms other place, that sort of thing. But anyway, so there's a Harvard, led by David Keith, and Frank Kreutsch, as in the video, have gotten together, have a geoengineering center. They've collected some money from various foundations, Bill Gates and people like that, and they would like to conduct the first outdoor geoengineering experiment. Since this is sort of fairly controversial thing, and at least one previous attempt at an outdoor experiment called the SPICE experiment, which was tried in the UK a couple of years ago, eventually was not done because of sort of public protest and outcry. Um, um, that Harvard decided to put together an advisory committee to provide guidance on the ethics and the governance and the appropriateness and the conditions under which this experiment would fly. I ended up on this committee, so what I want to talk to you about is how we've been thinking about it and get your feedback and thoughts. And so the essence of sort of the debate is on the last two bullets here, is that some argue that no open-air geoengineer experiments ought to occur without appropriate global governance, because this is a technology that would affect everybody. And the argument is, well, there's no right to start fiddling with the atmosphere until there's a way for to get input, participation. At least input, if not consent, from everybody affected. And others argue that that's sort of a recipe for never doing anything until we're in the midst of an emergency and need to act and haven't done any of the research and the development so that we can decide, have the information in order to act in the best way possible, in the safest way possible. So this is the situation we're grappling with. So Harvard established this advisory committee about whether Scope X should occur and under what conditions. There's 9 of us. We report to the Vice Provost for Research at Harvard, and we've got 4 areas, 3 of which are fairly straightforward. We can chat about them if you like, but a scientific review, since this is private money, it hasn't gone through NSF or any sort of formal review process, so we're organizing that. A financial review, basically to make sure that there's full transparency in where the money for this is coming from, and that in particular it's not that the money is not coming from individuals or organizations like fossil fuel companies that would have an interest in developing alternatives to reducing climate change emissions. A legal review, does it conform to the appropriate regulatory standards, and then this public engagement. The legal review is in some sense very straightforward and then sort of box checking, because in fact there is not much legal governance. I mean, basically it goes up in a balloon. You don't want the balloon to fall on anybody's head or drift into front of an airliner, but other than that, there's not much legal structure. And then because of that, there's this public engagement. What does it mean to ask people about this, and who gets asked, and so forth? And that's sort of the richest area, and the one I'd like to chat with you guys about. Okay, so here's the yeah, please.
On the previous slide, you talked a little bit about legal review. Well, let's see. What's the jurisdiction for the laws that you're checking against, especially if the effects of this type of experimentation cannot meaningfully be localized to single countries, unless I'm wrong about that latter point as well?
Yeah, no, the legal review is entirely focused on individual countries, because there is no governing international law. And the physical effects of this experiment are very localized. I mean, the actual release of the experiment is a tiny amount of material, and it's not it's not going to go have any effect even within the nation, and certainly not over borders. So there is no international structure. So it really is just the local laws that apply at the launch site. And the first launch site is likely to be in Sweden. They've got a space center up in northern Sweden. There's a lot of considerations on you need the right weather conditions and so forth. And so and then balloon companies that are willing and able to fly this thing. And so the first launch site's going to be, if it goes, would be this summer, summer 2021 in Sweden. And so that was actually a little bit of a surprise to us. So we're busy trying to find Swedish lawyers who do this sort of thing, and then the release experiment would be in presumably in the United States, in which case U.S. Law would apply, the FAA and then local environmental laws. That answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay, great. Okay, good. So this is the experiment. SCOPE-X stands for Stratosphere Controlled Perturbation Experiment. And basically the idea is you've got this balloon, and these balloons fly all the time, and it goes up to the stratosphere. Actually, I didn't send you a link of these balloon flights, but they're kind of cool. So then the Harvard team is building this gondola, which in many ways is just an instrumentation package. It weighs like 600 kilograms. So I mean, it's not a trivial thing. In addition to the beautiful balloon launch videos, you can find some where the balloon launch goes wrong and the balloon drags its gondola through a parking lot full of cars, which is not so great for the cars. But in any event, so it's a heavy gondola. What's unique about this is the gondola maneuvers. So it's got propellers and it's got this ascender thing. And so the idea is that this would go up and they would release a small amount of calcium carbonate into the stratosphere. And then with the propellers and the essentially the pulley that allows the gondola to go up and down relative to the balloon, they would fly back through the plume and measure what it's doing. And so they're interested in turbulence, how turbulence affects the distribution of the particles, other microphysics, what do the particles do as you release them? Do they glom together? Do they disperse? That sort of thing, and how big do they become? And that's all very important for thinking about the eventual efficacy of this sort of geoengineering, because the optical properties of the particles depend on how big they are and so forth. And then evaluate stratospheric chemistry. So sulfate aerosols are the natural particles, the ones that the volcanoes blow up there. So we have some sense of how they operate in the stratosphere, but they tend to be really reactive. They eat up ozone and do other stuff. Calcium carbonate has similar optical properties, but is much more inert, but there's no natural source in the stratosphere. So, the atmospheric chemists think they know how it will perform in the stratosphere, but one of the things the experiment would do would see whether the actual measured performance is consistent with the model. So I mean, fundamentally, they've got chemical and microphysics and turbulence models that say what the plume ought to do, and they want to send this balloon up there, release the plume, fly the balloon back, the gondola back through the plume, and see whether the particles in the plume behaves like they think it should. And then that would allow people then to go back and think about what would it look like to, design an airplane nozzle to put the plumes out, and how would a system work. So it looks like they want to launch in June 2021 up in Sweden. In which case we would have to sign off on this platform launch in mid-February to make all the contractual stuff work. And then, so if that flies, the platform launch flies, which means that they would just send up the platform and fly it around and have it go up and down, but they would not release anything into the atmosphere. And then if that all works, then they would aim to have a release in the US, a release launch where they fly it up and then they actually release something. Again, it's not so much that anybody could actually detect it, but there's at least perceived to be this sort of psychological, ethical, moral Rubicon between actually releasing something. And that would happen about a year from now.
So this advisory committee, there's 9 of us. Actually, there's sort of 8.5. Louise was our chair, but she had to resign because some critics thought she's a fairly high-level official in the state of California. She runs the Strategic Growth Council, which hands out the state's cap and trade money. And so the people were interpreting her being on the advisory committee, chairing it, as being an endorsement of the state of California of solar radiation management geoengineering. So she has largely stepped down, and then everybody else shifted from their work to their Gmail addresses. Sort of a mix of people. Most people have some connection to geoengineering. And so this is essentially what we're currently thinking, and this is what I'd love to get your thoughts on. We can take the discussion anywhere you want, but is that we as an advisory committee would ask Harvard to sponsor a participatory engagement in the community where the release launch would occur. So who decides, it would be people in the local community. And we would ask participants to make recommendations regarding, the experiment itself, basically, informed consent. Do you mind this thing flying above your heads? And that's a rather narrow, conceived as a very narrow, fairly narrow question. Is it basically resolving around safety? Will the balloon? Are you convinced that the risks are small enough that the balloon will fall on your head? That sort of thing. But then also engage them with the broader questions of what do you think is the appropriate process if geoengineering goes forward of consent? What do you think that participation and consent and governance ought to look like? If these experiments go forward and get larger and eventually start heading towards deployment, how should people be engaged? Who should decide? Who should have a right to block it? That sort of thing. We would also ask Harvard to sponsor a online forum and discussion so people around the world can comment, and that commentary would be part of the input to the local discussions. And so we the advisory committee would use this input to make recommendations regarding whether ScopeX ought to proceed the experiment, and make recommendations and comments about the future of global governance on geoengineering, in particular, what future experiments ought to do in terms, should they continue to this sort of engagement? What sorts of things ought they to do? So we kind of see this as a pay forward, that since and trying to be an intermediate position between the don't do anything until you have global governance, versus we need to have experiments go forward, and say there's not global governance. It's good to have experiments go forward, but each experiment ought to contribute to the future of global governance. So if the experiments go forward, we start to build up this web of governance. And yeah, go ahead.
So we have a couple of conversations going on in the chat, but I think it might be a good start to have Ali talk about her question on what the community of stakeholders for the stratosphere looks like.
Great.
Yeah, just genuine question. I mean, like when you say, you talk about the stratosphere and then you're saying community, and I'm thinking about like geographic resolution of that, and what does that mean, and whom, and like if there is an answer, what sort of consensus is there around that?
Yeah, so I'm busy trying to find your comment in the chat. Yeah, so in terms of geography, I don't know that we have a strong consensus or understanding of what the boundaries are, but we're thinking that for the deliberative engagement, we're
we would focus on people who live in the region where the balloon is launched. So assuming this is done in a in a rural area of a U.S. state, and they've talked some about New Mexico and Oregon as potential launch sites. It would be people in the region around these, launch sites. Say people who live within 50 or 100 miles of the launch site, and that we would try to make this, get have all voices represented. So try to get a representative or representative group in the sense of representatives of all the different communities in the region, but it would be locally focused, and that we would have this online forum so people around the world could contribute. The challenge is that there's a lot of well-organized interest groups on this, and so if it were just if we did it globally and open to all, then the discussion might be would dominate, right? And so that having this geographic focus, brings in new voices, and there is sort of this notion that since this is it could be a consequential experiment in that it would be the first open air one, that the community would be associated with that in some way, and so that they are people who ought to be engaged on both the local issues of participating in the discussions. Is this safe? Is this thing going to fall on you? So forth, and that in fact the comments that I've been making, that this release is really inconsequential in any environmental sense, but it is above your heads. But also engaging them in the broader discussion of hey, how should citizens, how should people be involved in these decisions, which will be place-based but can affect everybody in the world.
So further point of clarification. The experiment, as you pointed out, would have limited effects for this pilot. But you're thinking about, would the governance structure for the experiment be necessarily different from the governance structure for the broader deployment? I'm getting that's the sense. Okay.
Yeah.
And the goal is to for that future deployment case, or to come up with structures for the experiment itself, or to do both essentially.
We're mostly focused on the proper procedure for experiments, because presumably any deployment is a long way away. But the sense is that we would, that I suppose that we want to put in place, start putting in place, if nothing else, norms, and then understanding of what citizen concerns are, what people think about this. And that's the information part, what works and what doesn't in terms of engaging people. It's not clear, you can get a room full of people and actually engage them on the global implications of something that's kind of, new and esoteric. So how does that work? And then this norm that in the absence of, any sort of appropriate governance, that if you're doing experiments in this area, you ought to contribute to the development of at least some sort of governance structure.
Right. So we have a couple of questions. I saw Swaptic and Sarah turn up their hand. Swaptic, would you like to go ahead and sort of come up with something?
Yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful information. So my biggest question is, when we talk about the governance structure, so government that government when we talk about a government structure, that government structure has to derive its validity from someone. Like if they are governing, then they have been given that power to govern by someone. So where
Yeah.
do we think that governing entity is coming from? So if I imagine, like for example, it's an international collaboration or like multinational collaboration. So if we like do a predictive analysis, we will typically find out that that power has been given to that government by the citizens of that country to negotiate on their behalf, right? So basically that depends every election cycle on the whims and the mood of the people and how information has been spread. So like if for example going forward, the biggest most important contributory factor, if my logic is correct, would be how like, for the lack of better word, how are we selling it? Like what's the narrative we are trying to do? And the alternate would of for that, like is there like a narrative component to it? Or if we think of it an other way, like how much in like how like what level of involvement would we actually want from people to have? Like because it won't be practical to assume that all the stakeholders involved, like we have to like take input from all the stakeholders involved, and to slow down the process considerably, because everyone has their own bias point from which they're coming from. So like how would we like, I don't know, harmonize these two disparate factors, if I can say?
Yeah, so no, really good questions. And the you know, there you can imagine sort of, you know, like different corners in the space you started to outline, right? You know, so I think when people talk about, you know, wanting an appropriate governance structure for geoengineering, particularly any geoengineering deployment, you might imagine some sort of organization which comes out of the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Conference of Parties. You know, so on the climate change mitigation side, there is an international treaty which pretty much all countries have, all governments have signed on to. They meet in they've got, you know, meetings which they do essentially, and then they have break off different committees that come out of that, but essentially which are meant to set targets and timetables and reporting requirements, et cetera, for emission reductions, right? And so there's a lot of debate on whether that's actually the right and the most effective way to mode of governance for climate change mitigation. But some people envision something like that, which would monitor, regulate, you know, coordinate, and make any decisions, you know, how much and so on and so forth. So that would be one, and that would derive its authority from you know, the national governments and you know, coming together through a United Nations framework, right? And or some other international agreement. And so we could also debate whether that's, you know, the appropriate way to do that, whether it's truly representative and so forth. But that would be one structure, but nothing like that exists. On the another end of the spectrum, there are national regulatory frameworks, which, you know, in the Sweden and the U.S., I mean, come out of you know, sort of this, you know, the authority of the governments in those cases, but the regulatory frameworks there really don't get at, I mean, they get at just a very narrow slice of the issues here. So there's this sort of vast space in between, which you know, which currently doesn't exist. And so the question we're grappling with is, you know, where to come down in that space and what to do. And so, you know, and then also, you know, like, okay, you know, so like who appointed us to do this, which is essentially Harvard. And they decided that they wanted to collect the money and do this experiment. So, you know, we don't want to, or, you know, we think there are reasons you don't want to load up too much requirements or expectations on a single experiment. Otherwise, you're back in the we never do an experiment and never learn anything. But we're trying to set up at least some channels so that of commentary and participation and input, so that people have a chance to comment, to learn, comment, be heard, have their have their voices matter, and embed these experiments in some process which you could see, at least see a possibility that it heads to a place where you you start to you start to put together a system where, in fact, you do get some appropriate governance coming in. So, and a third piece to that is there are, in a lot of scientific areas, professional standards, agreements within the scientific community. There's some on biotechnology, in a couple of other areas where there are conventions who have got together and said, these are sorts of things we're going to do, and these are sorts of things we're not going to do. And there's not a it's not a governmental structure on top of that. It's basically, the people involved. So there's a way you could think about what's going on here is something like that as well. Is that the community of the scientific community that would be the agents by which this technology, if it comes into existence, would come into existence, are looking around for what their norms ought to be, and that we're suggesting to them that, well, maybe your norm is that you ought to engage the public before you do one of these things.
And I think another, if we look at if we look in the field where different nations are interacting, I think the one more thing maybe we can think about how to reduce the bystanders effect. For example, if there are 10 countries working on a common goal project, 5 of them may think that let the other 5 take care of it, I'm poor anyway, and if they are able to control the climate change, then it will help me also, so why should I get involved in this? So I think that is where maybe the future, I don't know, the narrative part can go, I guess.
So say that again. I mean, so
so basically, I think if you look at all those, all the current climate change adaptation or the emission standards, I think there is a tiny hint of bystanders effect going on there. For example, if there are 10 countries who are collaborating over solving climate change or addressing climate change, the 5 of them may think that let other 5 handle it, because if they are able to resolve the climate change, then it will impact me and I'm not paying anything for it. So should there be some legal, not legal, but some guardrails against it? Is there something which can be built into the experiment, or this is something which should be kicked down the road, if I may say?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly on the climate adaptation and mitigation side, the mitigation is reducing greenhouse gases. Adaptation is, building levees and green space and stuff to deal with the impacts. That sort of question is central to many of the discussions and negotiations and policy frameworks. Both the way that you described it, let those guys go forward. And they'll figure it out, and then I can just follow. But also the other side of particularly between the developed and developing countries, and then China is sort of in the high emitting countries, is you guys are you guys are have developed and put all these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And now it's harming everybody, but mostly poor countries. And so you guys ought to, take the responsibility. The developing countries say to the richer countries, you guys need to spend the money, reduce your emissions first, and we get to emit for longer, and we'll deal with it later. And so you get and then, oh, by the way, you ought to compensate us for all the costs we're going to incur for dealing with flooding and extreme heat, et cetera, because it's your that caused our damages. And so those you get a lot of those sorts of debates. With geoengineering, it's sort of another dimension to this because in the for greenhouse gas emissions, you emit in one place and the gases go everybody and cause everybody problems. With geoengineering, one country or like even one really rich organization or individual could buy 100 airplanes and have them fly around and put stuff up and adjust the climate how they want it, right? And so there's this, hey, wait a minute, we don't want you just going off and doing that and adjusting things the way you like it or trying, and without our consent. And so how does that work?
So maybe like how we say fear of missing out.
Swaplik, we have other questions. If we can sort of.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Luke Matthews, you want to jump in? Luke.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for a really
Hi,
fascinating intro to this. Question, I guess, would be, you mentioned a few times the idea that there isn't the relevant governance, and I've encountered that argument before in some research I was doing on METI experiments, messaging extraterrestrial intelligence experiments.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And the thing is, and I think there's a philosopher involved in that, Kelly Smith, who I think convinced me that we have even global governance. No one likes it. No one's really happy with it. But we have the United Nations, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes I think scientists say that as a bit of a cop out, like, oh, there's no governance, so I just do stuff, right?
Yeah.
But that said, the way this isn't like communism, right? So the way our governance system works at the UN or in a liberal democracy is the government has to make laws against things that you can't do them. I mean, otherwise the default is you can do stuff, right? If there's no law against it. So it just seems to me that like to really regulate this in an appropriate way that gets the consent of the governed and so forth, we'd need national governments or potentially the UN to actually like legislate or right. I mean, we have a process for agreeing about these things. Again, we're not always happy with it, but we have one.
Yeah. So as you said, yes, that's I agree with what you say. There are no laws against doing this right now. So there aren't any laws. Other than having to comply with the legal review would make sure that this conforms to any national laws. There is no international law. The Framework Convention. There's no. The UN has not done anything. There's the Convention on Biological Diversity, which says you shouldn't do any geoengineering deployment that would affect biological diversity without essentially getting consent from everybody. And this complies with that because it doesn't, at least in the judgment of the people doing it, and we'll review all that. Has no effect on biodiversity. So it is allowed. And so I suppose the governance question is, should experimenters wait? Obviously they shouldn't do things which are illegal. And there's some sort of totally different geoengineering issues where people may have done stuff that's illegal. But on this one, it's it's clearly allowed. Right, what they're doing is clearly allowed. But is that sufficient? Should they wait until either a national government or the UN puts together a structure for experimentation or eventual deployment, or should one just go ahead and apply comply with existing law, or should one do something in between and have expectations which go beyond, existing law?
Yeah. No. Okay. So yeah, I see that question. I mean, I think clearly there's ethical and unethical ways to do this. The legal matters, right? I guess I was thinking more like from a putting on my policy hat kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like if people are doing it seems like this is credible, and this may be something that is, I mean, is plausible to have benefit or should be done. I mean, it just seems to me that our governments or potentially the UN should get their act together and make some laws about this. Just like I was checking quickly on Google, there's lots of laws about cloud seeding. There's like national law review articles about it. I found out in Texas I can apply for a permit from such and such state entity and start my cloud seeding business, right?
Yes.
But I mean, yeah, I mean, as a citizen, I guess I'm saying I think I would like to see that happen before someone starts, I don't know what they're doing, pulverizing coral reefs and spreading them through the stratosphere. No, I'm sure you're not getting the carbonate that way.
Yeah. The carbonate will presumably come from benign sources. Yeah. So I mean, the counter argument is that we've been it's been at least 30 years since the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the the international community, and actually most national governments are still flailing around trying to come up with a coherent response, and to wait to do any experimentation at all on this topic until national governments and the UN get their act together means that we may wait another decade or three, and at that point sometime at that time we may discover we'd have really loved to do benign experiments so that we can
I'm in complete agreement. I think the experiments are benign. I mean, this is just kind of qualitative, but I think actually in terms of like, if we wanted to have sensible regulation, or I can't see how you get consent really at a large scale without the governmental process. Yeah. Like I think where the UN has been effective at that, right, are examples where countries did things on their own first within the borders of their country, and then you got the global community to buy. So you got to lead from the front, I think. But granted, I mean, on the climate change issue, we haven't been doing that. But on things like universal human rights, that didn't come from the UN, and then all the countries of the world are like, oh yeah, human rights, that's a good thing, right? I mean, there's individual countries like ours and others that said this is everyone's going to have these rights here in our borders, and then that got extrapolated, is what I mean. So people are sometimes like turning it on its head from what historically actually worked to accomplish things.
And I think that may be what people are trying to do here, which is say, okay, we'll do things which are legal, and maybe that'll help jumpstart the process for the international community getting its act together on this.
So there is a question. There are lots of interesting angles going on in the chat, but there is one particular question tee up from Teddy Parker's conversation. So we've been talking about stakeholder engagement and sort of under implicit assumption, maybe not on your part, but on my part definitely, an implicit assumption that all stakeholders are built equal in this type of. But then Teddy raises the issue that there are systematically differential impacts of these types of deployment on different types of countries. So countries closer to the equator might have different impacts compared to countries closer to the poles. How do we sort of take into account that difference in impact in this type of experimentation? That suggests something less democratic.
Yeah. So just really good question, and just to start parsing it a little bit. While deployment will clearly have differential effects on different peoples, in different places and in different situations, though it may not be apparent, either before or after exactly, what those effects are. I mean, we'll know something, though there may be, things we don't know about it. which actually had another whole really interesting discussions. But so yeah, deployment, that's definitely true for deployment in a physical sense, that you get a drought and it hurts you and not me, and the geoengineering contributed to the drought being in your river basin and not mine. The experiment, this experiment doesn't have any direct physical effects on anybody, wherever they live. That's the claim. So we could discuss that. But the claim is it has no direct physical effects. The perturbation on the atmosphere is infinitesimal, and the effects are all in terms of precedent, breaking down barriers. Moral hazard is a phrase that people use, that this option will, the more that this option is seen as acceptable and available, the more it may change the way people think of other parts of climate change, policy. Some people argue that the availability of this option will make people less focused on emission reductions, and so so that the effects of, though other people argue the exact opposite, but the idea is that the effects of this experiment could have differential effects on people in different parts of the world, but none of them would be direct. They would all be consequences, sort of political, social, cultural consequences of pathways that were enabled by this experiment. And the and that's why we came up with this, locally focused, but so it's unclear, sort of like really unclear who are the appropriate people to ask for this experiment. And so we, our thinking is focused on let's go with the bounded and in some sense traditional thing of ask the people where you're launching, but also have this and have that be the more structured engagement where you spend time worrying about who's at the table and making sure you've got all the relevant local voices at the table, and running a structured process, and do that locally, and then just have this much more open global chat line essentially, and invite people to participate with all the the pros and cons of that, but have this two-pronged structure to try to address it affects nobody but everybody in different ways issue. I don't know, does that capture or at least begin to address your question?
Yeah, it begins to address it. I think that this is, I didn't mean for the question to be something that you would have an answer to. But
okay, all right, okay.
Yeah. I
We
don't know.
do need to do something by mid-February, so
Yeah, I think we're in the last few minutes. I don't know. Other people who have questions, feel free to jump in. The other thing that might be interesting to explore is, I will stop talking. Other people feel free to jump in.
Okay. Basically, Todd's question about is benign experiment? Yes. And is it dependent on scale? On the physical parts, yes. I mean, that it clearly depends on scale, and the argument that's benign depends on it being small scale. In terms of crossing a Rubicon, the scale may be less relevant, right? Sort of any crossing of the Rubicon may, at least in some people's minds, open up pathways that were not previously open, may legitimize actions that were not previously legitimate. So in that sense, benignness doesn't depend on scale.
So Rob, we've only got a couple minutes left, and I'm wondering if it would be of interest and value to you if we did like a mini hackathon on this, because it seems like we've got a bunch of people who are interested, and there's so many interesting issues to scratch out.
Yeah, no, that I mean, I would really enjoy that. I think that'd be great. Yeah. So if you guys were up for it, yeah, would definitely.
Yeah, cool. Let's try and figure out how to do something maybe in January, because it looks like your clock is ticking.
Yes. Yeah.
But I'm thinking maybe we do something, it's a couple of 2-hour sessions over a week.
Okay.
And we would figure out how to frame, what are I think we could frame this so that you would hopefully get some useful information and talking points.
Okay, that'd be great. Yeah, no, I'd really enjoy that. That'd be fabulous. Cool. Good.
One of the angles that has come up in the chat is this idea of what do we owe future generations?
Yes.
Yeah. And I think I don't know, Ben, do you want to say something about the how to frame that question properly, and if that question has useful answers?
Well, yeah, I mean, my take on that is it's maybe not a useful rabbit hole to go down, because there's not really a good answer. A lot will depend on your philosophical theory, and I think we could probably proceed in a hackathon context with the assumption that we do have obligations to future generations, and we want to leave them the best possible climate we can, and avoid some of the knottier issues. That would be my proposal.
Okay, yeah. I mean, we're definitely. I mean, this idea of paying forward, and the idea that this knowledge may be important to leaving a good climate to future generations. But very cognizant of the notion that some people think that this this whole line of activity is in fact dangerous for future generations. I mean, so that's very much in our thoughts, but so maybe it's just like a rabbit hole that takes us to bad places, but there may be some really interesting ways to think about those issues.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, I mean, what's actually easier about this case is this doesn't seem to involve the same amount of current sacrifice that a lot of the other activities that we ought to be taking to improve the climate involve, right? Where we have to set aside our own utility today for the benefit of people who don't yet exist. So in some ways, this is the sidesteps some of the harder practical challenges, if not raising others.
Yeah, I mean, though it raises others. I mean, there's the if you actually started doing this, it commits you to always doing it until you've managed to get all the CO2 out of the atmosphere. Because if you then stop, some people, critics have compared it to like heroin. You kind of keep taking more and more, but you can never stop without a huge withdrawal. Because if you stop, then the temperature would just leap up. The Earth's temperature would leap up very quickly and in a massively destructive way. So, I mean, it reduces current costs, but it in some sense requires then future generations to keep it going until they've solved the underlying problem.
And one weird thing to maybe think about this, and it may be a very, I don't know, weird thing, for the lack of a better word, but technically if we look at it from this point, we don't owe future generation anything because they don't currently exist. I think it for me it was I always thought that it was created so that like the current generation, because the future generation will be the current generation, sons, daughters, family, right? So we have a certain biological biasness toward our future generation. So maybe it was done to personalize or maybe get personal stake into the overall good well-being of it. So maybe if we reframe the question as just leave the earth as it is, like whatever the current scenario is, we just, like, after all the inflows and outflows, the stock which we inherited should remain the same stock. Maybe that's it. And there is maybe some minor adjustment for population here and there, but maybe that's the way we can frame the question.
Interesting. Okay. But then there's like, how do you transit to that state? Because we're currently not in that at all, right? plus the world's very unjust, and the current way of thinking about how you make at least material more just material is to keep altering those flows so that they're even more out of balance.
Yep, makes sense.
We have a lot here. There is a lot.
Okay.
I think we should plan for something in January to
at
least be more concrete and productive for you, and definitely to be more interesting for us.
Okay, great.
So
that'd be great.
I don't know. Let's thank our speaker. This was awesome. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.